The gardens clung to the bones of the red keep like little patches of stubborn green, the thin soil smelling of damp clay and crushed mint, the sea's breath gathering at the ramparts and turning the leaves to coins that flashed and dulled by turns. Sansa preferred the gardens to the rest of King's Landing. Even a little wind could carry the stink down the hill and turn it to a tonic of salt and rosemary and old earth. The trees here were not the ones of her childhood. No red leaves like small fires, no bone-white trunk carved with faces older than histories, but she treated a young olive as though it might listen, tracing her finger along the whorls in its bark and whispering the truths that could not be given any other home. The city below looked like something spilled and never cleaned, the way dye would dry thick on a seamstress's thumb if she paused a moment too long. Tents along the streets gave the impression of a fair that had fallen asleep in the middle of itself. Voices rose and fell with the day's heat, and when the wind changed she could count the sounds as if they were beads. The clatter of carts on cobbles, the clink of cups from a wine cellar's stall, a boy shouting of oranges brought by a Lysini boat before dawn. She closed her eyes long enough to pretend she was in the winter town on a market day, where the cold sharpened everything into clean lines. Wood, leather, snow, and even a quarrel sounded like split firewood. But here the edges ran together, as they did in the stories Cersei thought she told. Loud and thick, with gleams polished over the blemishes. Above the olive a gull cried, sailed inland on a gust, and turned like a piece of paper held up to a candle. Footsteps approached on the crushed shell path. Not hurried, not hesitant either. Soft-souled, assured. She stiffened, then forced the stiffness out of her shoulders the way a maid might rub a wrinkle from linen with the heel of her hand. Fear showed in small things. She had learned that. Her face, when she turned, was a gentle mask, the one she had worn since the day her father's head fell and the sky turned to iron. Oberyn Martell looked at her as if she were a riddle he intended to take his time with. He was not a large man, not in the northern sense. The men she had grown up with were hewn from air like winter horses, long and severe, with quiet a sort of speech all its own. But the Dornish prince was something else. He moved like a candle flame in a draught that never guttered. The layers of his robe, a fine sand-colored silk and beneath it a deeper saffron that called to mind preserved lemons, shifted when he walked, and the light found the threads and made them seem to breathe. He smelled of orange blossom and saddle leather. He smiled, but there was a gap between that expression and his eyes, as if he had learned to keep his smile in one room and his thoughts in another. "Lady Sansa," he said, as though the words did not belong to anyone else in the city. "It is overcast, and yet the sky pretends brightness. I am new to the northern habit of reading weather as scripture. Are you, perhaps, fluent?" She looked up. The clouds were thin, stretched into ribbons the color of pigeons' necks, and the sunlight through them made the world look bleached. "It will not rain today," she said, "but there will be a wind toward evening that smells of the foundry." "The foundry," he repeated, amused. "So precise. Forgive me. I am told Dorne has very little to teach the North about finely cutting a day." Her lips wanted to curve. She had learned to let those wants travel along her cheekbones like birds, alighting and gone again, leaving only the memory of their weight. "Dorne teaches the rest of us many things, I hear. Some of them a little frightening. Only frightening to those who prefer night to possess all the sweetness," he said. "I prefer my fruits at noon and my vengeance in good light." He said the word with the ease of a man ordering wine in a tavern he visited often. She absorbed it without changing her posture. In King's Landing, the word vengeance possessed a taste. Iron, old smoke. In Dorne, perhaps it was a spice, balanced among salt and sugar. "I did not mean to intrude," he went on, and whether or not it was true, he said it like he respected the space between her and the olive as a small jurisdiction. "But I find the air here gives me thought, and I prefer to take my thoughts out walking. They sleep otherwise and grow fat." "Thoughts in King's Landing grow fat either way," she answered before she could pull the words back. It was dangerous to be quick, but the day had its own courage, and it had slipped into her like a draft through an unlatched window. His eyes, a dark burnished brown, warmed. "Lady Sansa," he said again, softer. "May I sit?" The bench beneath the olive was shallow. It forced politeness from any who would share it. She moved to one side and he sat at the other. The silence between them had a good weight. She thought then of how a river might carry a boat without fuss, and she surprised herself with a sudden memory of Arya's hands on N, that was too long for her. The way she laughed when it bumped the side of the skiff and left a black smear. The memory was so clear it tasted of pitch and cold, and Sansa had to look hard at the prince to stay in the present. "I did not expect the gardens to be quiet," he remarked. "There is a wedding on the wind. Even the sparrows rehearse for such a thing in my country." "Here the sparrows rehearse for crumbs?" she said, and felt her tongue stung by the insolence. But the prince laughed, not unkindly. "I am told," he said, "that you love lemon cakes." She had not eaten lemon cake enough to hold a taste of it now. The memory of the thing had slipped into song, and she could not be sure whether she remembered the scent of it or only a rhyme a septa once taught her about good girls and good sweetness. Still, the mention of it made a place incid. Her chest softened like butter near a hearth. "I did," she said, "but a love of what one cannot have turns the matter into something else." "Desire?" he offered. "I have been accused of that one." "Story," she said. "It becomes story." "Ah," he said, with such appreciation it might have been a toast. "That is worse. Stories do not feed the body, but they feed the hunger that can never be sated." They were not alone in the gardens. A pair of serving men crossed with a covered tray, arguing beneath their breaths about whether duck or goose better suited an old lady's teeth. 2 gold cloaks passed along the higher walk, their steps too large for the path, one sword knocking the low hedge and shaking a scatter of crushed rosemary into the air. But the space around the bench was separate, as if the olive drew a circle. "You are far from home," he said, and the words were not a question and not a sympathy. He was a man who was precise about the shapes he carved out of the air. "So are you," she said. "Not so far," he said. "Dorne is a hard horse, but not a long one. The distance between here and there is measured as much in customs as in miles. I have learned to walk slowly on these stones and not to show my teeth unless I mean to bite." The last he said with a slant of humor that would have been less interesting if it were kinder. "My father used to say," Sansa murmured, "that the distance between a vow made at a feast and the vow kept in winter is the true measure of a man's name." "Your father," he said, and something there shifted, like a foot finding the real stair beneath a carpet that had lied. "I knew him in his repute. I am sorry. The word is small, but then so are many important things." He looked out at the city. "I have not come to King's Landing to be sorry," he added, and then he looked back at her. "I have come for justice." She held her breath for 2 heartbeats, and when she let it go it was in silence. She had learned to be silent in small places and large ones. The prince watched her in a way that did not press, and she felt the old reflex move in her, the one that weighed men by their impatience. Joffrey had pulled it quiet as if it were a rope to ring a bell. The hound had sat in it and let it be. The queen drank her silences like wine. The prince seemed to listen to them, as if they were birds he hoped to learn. "What do you think justice is?" she asked, and she did not know whether she was asking a man or testing a wire. "It is a word with too much furniture," he said at once. "In the morning, you think you know where the chairs are, and in the dark you bark your shins on something someone moved while you slept. But my sister died and her children died, and the men who did it sit in rooms with tapestries and pretend the stains on their shoes are wine. I came to see whether words would make them admit to wine. If they do not, I will have to find other ways." "My father died," Sansa said, and the air around that fact was always something like ice. "The man who did it sits in a room with tapestries." She did not say the name. Names were flint. "So," he said, "we find ourselves neighbors across a small field." She looked at his hands. They were not soft, though they had been given every chance to be. The knuckles bore old scrapes that had not risen to scars. His fingers were clever-looking, in the way of a man who liked to disassemble a thing to understand it, and sometimes left it better or worse depending on what understanding required. He had a ring with a pale stone that might have been a polished bone, oval as a tooth. "If you came for justice," she said softly, You will not find it in the throne room." He lifted a shoulder. "I do not expect the king to compose an apology in good ink and hand it to me bound in fine leather. I am not an idiot, but the throne room is a marketplace. Men bring goods and pretend they are priceless. Women bring themselves and pretend it was choice, and everyone leaves having bought more rot than fruit. It is a good place to listen. One hears what people believe about their own lies." "And what do you hear there?" she asked. "That Queen Cersei keeps her anger where others keep their gods. That Lord Tywin was born with a ledger in his heart and writes with other men's blood. That the boy she calls son is the dangerous kind of fool." He looked at her gravely. "I am sorry for that last. There is nothing in him of you." The words struck like thrown seeds. She could feel what might grow from them if she watered them with thought. The boy had been her dream once, gold and song and a white horse. He had burned from the inside with a joy at cruelty that made Sansa think sometimes of a snowbank in spring. It looks like the same clean heap, but beneath there is water cutting it away. A slow theft that ends in a collapse all at once. She felt tired in a way that did not belong to muscles. "You do not flinch," the prince said after a time. "I have seen older men fail at that. They pretend their ears are rocks. I have learned to look. If I close my eyes, the world still does its work." She turned her gaze to the handrail where the rosemary had grown over and around the iron, making it look as if the garden were slowly swallowing the red keep whole. "I am not brave. Bravery is one of those words like justice," he said. "It needs too many arguments to be useful. You are something else. There is a man in my country who teaches swords to boys who will never be men. He says, 'A still hand is not the same as a weak hand.' I begin to think you are the still sort." The wind shifted and brought the smell of the fish market, strong at first and then not, like a hand lifted from a wound. Sansa folded her fingers one over the other and felt the small bones, the way they made a little architecture to hold her up. She could be still because everything inside her had learned to climb. "If I asked you for a favor," he said, sounding for the fur. "St time a little careful. Would you know I asked as a man who means what he says?" She glanced around. The serving men had returned with the tray gone. The gold cloaks with their thoughtless stride were not in view, and a pair of court ladies were walking along the lower path with the intentness of women trying to look like they did not intend to be seen. The prince, despite all his well-spoken danger, had chosen a bench under an olive to speak with her. That choice mattered. Choices made sense of things. She looked down at her hands again, and when she raised her eyes, she let them hold his. "You may ask," she said. "Very small," he said. "And then, if you decide very large. The small is this. Would you come as a guest to my apartments? Ilaria is there, and she has a talent for talking to women without confining them. You will not find that talent elsewhere in this keep. You have my word that you will not leave with less dignity than you bring with you. I will have lemon cakes baked, not as a seduction but because hospitality should ask a question and answer it at once. The question being, are you hungry? If you cannot come as my guest, I will accept that and we will not speak of it again. If you can, the large favor follows." "What is the large favor?" "We will not talk about it here," he said with a small shake of the head. "Sunlight is honest, but it is also indiscreet. Come, and I will ask a thing that might be a burden, and you will say no if you cannot bear it. I will not be offended. I have walked with women sent to keep me safe from myself. I know what it is to be given a harness and told to call it a gown. She should refuse. If she were the girl she was at 11, she would accept at once. If she were the woman she imagined she might be at 25, she might refuse with a graceful lie and keep her power. But she was neither. She was a girl without a house and a woman without a country." And the prince had said something that had not been said to her openly in months. "I will not take what you do not give. I will come," she said, and she understood she had just made a choice with a thread attached to it. Choices always had threads. She was learning to pluck them to make different songs. He inclined his head, and it was not a court bow and not a lover's bow. It was an acknowledgement like one craftsman gives another when a piece is well joined. He rose, then paused. "One more thing," he said lightly. since we are telling the truth with our eyes and lies with our mouths." He smiled without cruelty. "If you mean to put my invitation to a test, you may bring a chaperone you trust. But if you are bringing a lion to growl at me for taking an interest, I prefer the growl at the door to the claw at my throat." "I have no lions," Sansa said, and the name Cersei lay in the air between them like a dog asleep on a threshold. "And few friends." "Then make one with me if it suits you," he said. "If it does not, we will eat cake and the world will go on pretending to be sensible." When he had gone, he did not look back. She respected the courtesy of it. Sansa sat for a while and let her heart find its way into a slower room. She placed her palm flat against the bench and felt the grit on it. She had learned to read grit like weather too. How recently someone had come by, what shoes they wore, whether their haste made the particles jump. The bench told her only that it had been made by a man whose hands were large, from stone that did not enjoy being cut. She went to the olive and laid her forehead against the bark and thought of nothing at all for the space of 10 breaths. It was not prayer. It was a different sort of quiet, a rest made of refusal. Then she smoothed her skirts and walked to the outer door. The prince's apartments reminded her of the way tents grow in a market when the sun is cruel. Fabrics cascaded from the ceiling like water caught and tamed, and the air contained a conversation between unfamiliar spices that did not brawl but did not agree. Illyria Sand met her at the threshold and took Sansa's hands in both of her own, the way a sister might, or a woman who meant it. Her hair fell like a story, unforced and clever, and she wore a dress the color of apricots on the verge of bruising. "You are most welcome," Illyria said, and Sansa had the sense at once that welcome here was not the formal word it became in other rooms. "I have been in houses where the servants turn the words into a ritual and the ritual into a punishment. This is not such a place. If you desire to sit, sit. If you wish to stand, stand. If you want to eat, the plate is never empty. If you need to be angry, I will not tell you to be pretty as well." The corner of her mouth drew up. "I cannot stop men from telling you that, of course. But I can put a pillow between you and the sharp part." The lemon cakes were small and dusted with sugar that caught the light like frost. When Sansa bit one, the taste was the beast of memory tamed into something obedient and kind. She understood suddenly that the weeping she had felt all day had not been sorrow. It had been the exhaustion of wanting to cry and not being able to ask the world's permission. She swallowed hard and then drank water from a clay cup. The water was cool, and it tasted faintly of clay and mint. "Prince Oberyn tells me you like stories," Illyria said, drawing her neat bench closer with the side of her foot, so Sansa would not have to reach into a posture that looked like pleading. "I did," Sansa said. "Now I prefer to know what happened." "The difference between stories and histories is not as wide as men pretend," Illyria said. "Both choose their saints and their devils. Both remove the thirst and pretend events came to them already quenched. Shall I tell you something thin that might be real?" "Yes," Sansa said, surprised to hear the word from herself and more surprised at the relief she felt in saying it. "There is a woman who lives in the clothmaker's row," Illyria began, almost as though it were a children's tale. "She makes ribbons from dye scraps. She is poor and not ashamed. That is how you know she is very poor indeed. But she has a talent for listening to talk about nothing. If you give a woman talk about nothing, often she will line it and hem it and call it a dress. This woman sells those dresses to anyone with coin. I purchase one from her when I wish to know how the day is being told by women who have never seen the inside of this keep. They will tell you who watered their bread with tears and who bought bones from the kennel boy to make a soup that made him raise his eyebrows at how well dogs eat. They will also tell you which guard stumbled home late with his glove on the wrong hand and which made laughs when she should not. That laughter can be heard in the rooms we think are safe." Sansa knew this language. In Winterfell it would have been wrapped in frost-kissed courtesy. Who brought a pie to the sept, who went without. Here it came salted, in the mouth like olives. She felt a bright, low thing uncurl in her belly. Curiosity with a spine. The prince entered then, wiping his hands on a cloth dyed with crushed pomegranate. His sleeves rolled back and his forearms bearing the pale ladder of a long-ago scrape. He looked at Sansa and at Ilaria with an intimacy that included them both without diminishing either. "I have been binding a knife," he said, perching on a stool with that careless grace men affect when they are aware of being watched. "A friend sent it to me with a poor handle. I do not like to be friends with poor weapons. It seems a form of treachery, making a show of trust and then cutting yourself on the truth of it." He glanced at Sansa, and the glance was not a prod. It was an invitation. "The large favor," she said, because he had promised the shape of their talk and she believed in shapes. He rubbed his thumb along the line of his jaw, not to call attention to it, but like a man thinking. "A pact," he said, "not the sort a lord swears on a high day with banners and meat and men watching to make sure he means it. I want something smaller and more dangerous. Ilaria and I have the beginnings of a net. Nets are honest things. You throw them, you pull, you see what you have. But in a place like this, the water is crowded with fish pretending to be seaweed and rocks pretending to be fish. My people listen in the places where people are too tired to be clever. Baths, kitchens, doorways where men kick their boots and curse. I can make sense of some of what they bring me, but the stories within the keep I cannot always read. The language of courtiers bores me even when it is helpful. You, however, you speak it better than anyone else I have met here, and you speak it while hearing the language of cold air and running water that courteous people pretend does not exist. I could ask you to help me translate." Ilaria set her chin in her hand and considered Sansa in a way that had nothing to do with rivalry and everything to do with seeing whether a garment would fit without the seam showing. "You have learned to arrange your face like a table laid for guests," she said. "But your eyes cannot be told to be shy. They look too well. Men will not notice this because they do not wish to. Men do not like to believe that women see them. But women will. Women always do. I would teach you how to persuade them to share the seeing with you." Sansa let the proposal sit on the broad plate of her silence. She touched the edge of that plate as if to be sure it would not tilt. The dangers arrayed themselves like items on a clerk's list. Being seen with Dornish made her a target. Being seen in the prince's apartment made her a stain. Being suspected of knowing what she knew made her a throat to be cut in an alley. But danger had stopped being a separate room. It came into her bed and sat on her feet and breathed through her curtains. The only question was whether to talk to it or pretend not to notice. "What would you ask me to do?" she said. "Begin with simple things. Eat with us. Walk with us. Let the keep see that we are friendly, and the queen will be angry in a manner that produces new talk. Watch which women are sent to be kind to you afterward. Some will be genuine, lonely creatures or women who like to sit beside a fire and speak of how it used to be where they were girls. Some will be sent to weigh you. A few will be sent to sink their teeth into your throat. All will bring their own grievances with them like heavy baskets. We will sort the baskets. We will find out how gold moves and how wine moves and how men who sit on command chairs move when they think no one watches. We will give those movements names. We will assign them to maps. It is not a happy work," Ilaria said then, "but it is work, and work is one way to suffer less." Sansa remembered her mother's voice, measuring the household with lists and names, feeling the castle with her fingertips like a weaver checking a loom for flaws. The memory arrived with a small, steady ache that did not overwhelm her. It stood beside her and watched. She thought of Robb, who had needed loyalty as much as he had needed skill. Of Arya, who would have laughed and climbed the olive to spit on the walk when the gold cloaks came by. Of Bran, who might have asked the prince whether the south has trees that talk. She felt for them, as one in the dark reaches for faces on a quilt. "If I do this," she said, "it is not because I am Dornish or because I forgive the south for what it did to my house. It is because my name has been put to too many lies, and I will not lose it entirely." The prince's mouth softened. "The terms of honor are yours to draft," he said. "I am asking for your craft. I will give you mine. We will not be free of debt. We will be in a different kind of debt, the sort that is paid by doing the work well." He reached for the knife he had wrapped in cloth and unrolled it on the table. The blade was narrow, shimmered with the ghost of oil, and the handle was bound in dark leather in a pattern that invited the thumb and the palm to understand one another. It was a tool made to be a hand's companion. "I will not place a blade in your hand unless you wish it," he said. "But that does not mean you and I will have no weapons between us. There is no weapon so quickly forgiven as a good conversation carried to the wrong ear. It is so small, like a pinprick. The blood shows later. Words are the only weapons I am fit for," she said. "Not the only," Ilaria murmured, "but the ones that will feed us now." They began, as he had said, in simple things. Sansa ate meals where the plates were stacked between persons whose gazes did not flinch from one another. She did not realize, until she had sat through a supper without bracing herself for a kindness sharpened to a wedge, how hungry she had been for a room in which appetites were not offenses. Ilaria listened to her speak of snow with a seriousness that made her laugh in spite of herself, and then Ilaria told her about the heat in Dorne, how it taught people to save movement for when it mattered, to fit sentences into the shade, to leave aside the business of shouting until parched. "You cannot be angry in Dorne in the same way you are angry here," Ilaria said. "The sun will punish you for your pride. You learn to make your rage drink water." When they walked in the gardens, Sansa felt eyes cling to the corners of her dress like burrs. She pretended not to feel. She cultivated the quiet, level expression that had become her only armor in a place where steel belonged to other people. The Queen noticed, of course. Cersei noticed everything that injured her and most things that did not. A compliment arrived from a lady known for scorn. A cousin of Lord Tyrell invited Sansa to join a circle of women who embroidered cushions with stags and roses intertwined. Oberyn laughed when she described the invitation. "Beware cushions," he said. "They suffocate. Better to be stabbed. It teaches something." "Stabbing teaches not to sleep," Ilaria said, winding a ribbon around her wrist like a small leash. "Suffocation teaches despair. Do not learn despair. It is too easy to remember." So Sansa went to the cushion circle and found herself sitting among women whose hands moved like small birds above the linen, whose speech slid neatly around the task at hand, gathering little bits of thread from every story to knot into their own patterns. She listened. One woman spoke of a dressmaker who suddenly had orders for 3 wedding gowns in the same week from girls whose fathers had lodged money in the Iron Bank. Another mentioned a spice merchant who had lost his temper when his box of cloves was short by a handful that in truth would not anger a man who had not begun counting too carefully. Sansa placed these tidbits in a mental drawer and kept the drawer from squeaking. She began to name the drawers. Comforted her. A man who drank in the mornings and then stopped abruptly she called the held breath. A guard who changed his watch with a man who owed a debtor's boy she named the borrowed hour. A maid who never looked at herself in a polished metal ewer when other women did she named the absent glance. The naming helped her remember and kept her company when sleep was a thin blanket. At night, she sat sometimes in the prince's apartment while he sharpened tools on a stone that whispered like sand in waves. Ilaria would braid Sansa's hair in a style that made the weight of it gentle. "It is a small luxury to look like yourself," she said, as if she had found the words in a cupboard and polished them and given them away out of generosity. Sansa let herself be touched and learned that she had missed a thing she had never named. They spoke of maps. The prince's maps were not the sort with borders drawn like neat accusations. His were palimpsests laid over one another, one showing how grain moved up the river, another how wine moved down. Another had pins pricking locations where certain conversations were overheard with a consistency that argued for pattern. He showed her a map of corridors inside the keep where light at certain hours made it easy to stand and listen behind screens. He showed her another traced with wax lines that indicated who had the habit of walking in pairs and who, contrary to affection or duty, preferred to walk alone. Sansa took all of this in with a pleasure that surprised her. There were ways of knowing that were not pain. "Here," she said once, putting her finger on a corridor outside the royal sept. "The weepers gather on the second day of every week, women who have lost small things or think they have. They weep at the statue of the mother. The statue weeps too. There is a trick of the stonemason under the eye, a groove where water introduced at the shoulder runs to the corner and then falls on the cheek. When they have done there, they go to the shade of a column and wipe their faces and smile as if their sorrow had been paid a wage. The priest thinks he knows who takes money from whose hand there, but he is wrong. It is the cleaner who sees, and she gives the money to a boy who presses his fingers against the horse's legs in the street and judges the dust for iron. He does not do it because he loves horses. He does it because he reads the track of which Smith bought more that week. The prince watched her with the brightness of pride that made her warm and ashamed both. "See," he said to Ilaria, and the woman smiled as if she had expected nothing less. They built their own language, as alliances do when the city insists on hearing everything twice. A lemon cake was not a cake. It was a rumor sweet enough to travel. A pomegranate was a fact that, once broken open, yielded many smaller facts, staining the fingers. A small knife was a person who did not know she carried a secret that would hurt someone if dropped. A shawl was a lie spread thin over a large truth and thus a warning to avoid drafts. Sansa embroidered, and the embroidery became a ledger. She chose threads in patterns that made sense only to the three of them. A yellow cross at a corner meant a story had come from a room with 2 women in it and no more than 2. But if the cross had 4 arms of the same length, it meant the second woman was older and did not wish to be there. A blue dot in the center of a flower meant a conversation overheard on a walk between the kitchens and the servants' entrance. She did not have to hide anything. She left her work draped on a chair, and the maids would look at it and murmur over the neatness, while Cersei's fixer of small harms would pass her lip over the fabric and see only softness. Once, the queen sent for Sansa and asked her, in a tone like a jeweler inspecting glass, whether the Dornish had tried to adopt her. "It would be very like them," Cersei said. "They love other people's pretty things. They call it hospitality and give it a scandalous name when it suits them. But it is theft. Men in sand learn to bury what they take and pretend to forget where they left it." "I have been a guest," Sansa said, folding her hands over one another until she could not tell where the bones met. "And I am grateful. Gratitude is a currency you cannot spend twice," Cersei said. "Remember that." Sansa remembered, but she also remembered the way Illyria's voice fell when she spoke of girls in Dorne who laced knives into their hair, and how the men there did not pretend to be astonished by this, only proud. How the prince had looked at Sansa as if she were not someone's investment. The balance of those memories made a ledger no steward could audit. When Joffrey's wedding day approached, the city did what it always did when a spectacle drew nearer. It prepared to be cruel with an open hand. The bakers fashioned birds from crust and filled them with live birds to set free in a flock of terror. The dressmakers went blind, making hems look like water while providing nothing more than expensive cloth. The hedges were trimmed to look like trophies, and Sansa walked through it all as if she were moving through a painting commissioned by a man with no love of truth. Oberyn and Illyria stayed close the afternoon before, not hovering. He would not insult her with that, but near enough that if she turned she could catch the smell of oranges and iron and the faint spice that lived on Illyria's skin. "After the pageant," he said, "after we have said our speeches and eaten our strange little birds, I will have a thing to do. Perhaps you will come and sit with Illyria while I do it. So the women who are watching will tell a certain story to themselves about why." "What story?" Sansa asked. "That you have found an island where your feet do not always discover the nailhead hiding in the floor." He smiled. "We are not the safest island, but we are pretty, and we bite." Illyria took Sansa's hand and guided her to the window. The city below looked like it always looked, hungry and full of invention. "You will not drown," Illyria said. "You have learned to be your own raft. We will help you learn rudder." Sansa did not ask what the prince's errand would be. She suspected. The mountain's name rose like a thunderhead over every mention of roses and wine and merriment. The prince had come for justice, and justice in King's Landing often chose a stage to hurt someone on. When she imagined that stage, she did not feel exhilaration. She felt a small, clenching hope, not that the wrong would be righted by spectacle. She no longer believed in magic that worked by chant, but that a man who had spoken to her like an equal would not put his head under a falling blade and call it glory. The morning of the wedding, the bells rang with a cheerful malice. Sansa sat while a maid she knew as absent glance pinned her hair, the pins entering like little stings and setting a calm hurting that helped her keep her mind where her bodice required it to be. The gown would not forgive inattention. She wore a ring that meant nothing and a pair of gloves that meant everything. Ilaria had sewn microscopically small knots into the hems that told a story if one knew where to put her thumb to read it. Sansa did not need to read. She needed to know that the story was there. It was the difference between walking alone and walking with someone just behind you, the sound of a second step telling the road you were not to be bullied. The day unfolded as days do when a city watches them. Slowly and then all at once. Sansa ate nothing and drank water, and when the wine was pressed upon her, she let it touch her lips and did not let it speak to her. Joffrey's laughter was a hard thing, like pottery thrown too thin, brittle at the rim. The queen watched everyone and nothing. Her attention was a net she held as she stalked, and she meant to catch something but did not yet know what she wanted to catch. The Tyrell roses opened their petals by the hour and smelled less and less as the day wore on. Sansa's service began then. The pact they had not named in papers or with names was a living thing. She stood beside Ilaria and spoke to women who had come draped in husbands and expectations, and she gave them a way to talk. She let them believe one thing and another, and in that gentle dissonance truths slipped like fish into her fingers. A lady from Old Town spoke of a letter misdelivered and then returned by a meek boy with 2 new bruises around his throat. A Northern Nights lady remarked on the oddity of a cart of barley that arrived without mice. Barley without a mouse is like an apple without the skin. A man pulled at it, she said. You can taste when a thing has been pulled at. Sansa took these fragments and sent them down her arm to where Ilaria waited, her eyes quiet, her palms unloved so. She could touch the news and understand it with her skin. When the disaster of the feast came, because something always comes at a feast in this city, Sansa did what she had trained herself to do. She did not run and she did not freeze. She watched, she catalogued, she held in her mouth a scream like a coin one does not spend. She let Ilaria's fingers call her from the edge of shock and into the cover of a pillar. She saw what needed to be seen and no more than that. The prince, when he came to her later in a room that smelled of crushed fruit and fear, put his hands on her shoulders, and there was no triumph in his touch, no panic. There was purpose. I am not dead, he said plainly. I was offered a choice. I chose not to be stupid. I did not take the fight I would have liked to have. I took the one that leaves me standing. She did not know she would weep until air reached the place inside her where the kept tears had been. He did not hush her. He stood until she was done, and then Ilaria brought a wet cloth and pressed it to her temples and said nothing for a long time. The city changed in the next days, and Sansa felt the change the way a hawk must feel weather before it turns. Eyes keener, wings ready to tilt. The queen's attendants steeped their faces in wine-soaked cloths to hide the new anger. The gold cloaks moved in clumps, as if uncertainty required the comfort of elbows. The kitchens sent up smaller meat with larger sauce. Letters went out like bees and returned like gnats. Fast and innumerable, stinging, poor. Sansa listened. She walked inside the borders of their agreement and found them flexible enough to be useful but drawn with a moral she did not need to bless with Septa Mordane's hand. She wrote with needle and thread and did not name what she wrote. The net tightened. The prince spoke to the men he had to speak to, and in his speaking he did not give away the things that were not his to give. He did not promise her vengeance because men could promise that to keep women near. He promised her work, and the work promised the possibility of something like justice, if the definition allowed work to qualify. One evening, when the city had exhausted itself whispering about the wedding as children exhaust themselves running after a cart that will not stop, Sansa stood at the window in the prince's apartment and looked down at the hungry, inventive streets. She watched a girl step over a puddle with the care of someone who does not own more than one dress, and she watched a group of men move in the direction of food and then change direction when some other instinct tugged them toward spectacle. The gulls circled like greedy judges. Sansa folded her arms and laid her cheek against the cool stone. "Do you ever think you could leave this place?" she asked, more to the air than to the man behind her. "Without it coming after you? The place you are," Oberyn said from his table, where he was binding a new handle to an old blade, "always comes with you, but there are ways to make it walk behind rather than beside." "How?" "You name it," he said. "You don't let it name you." Sansa thought of the names the world had pressed on her like welts. Trader's daughter, the wolf cub, the little bird. the wife in a dress made by her enemies. She thought of the name that was hers and would always be Stark, and how if it were to live it would not be through conquest because she did not have an army, and it would not be through marriage because she was tired of men thinking her body was a road to a place they would like to be. It would live through something else, something patient and cold and steady. "Then let us begin," she said, turning, the stone cool on her back, her hands empty and steady, her voice a low flame that knew its own air. And so they began again, from the promise nestled quietly in a bench under an olive to the broad work that would take time and care and mistakes to learn. Sansa learned to marry courtesy to calculation, to run a hand along the length of a lie and find where it thinned. Oberyn learned to trust the shape of her thoughts in the rooms where he would always be counted a foreigner. Illyria learned the ways in which northern girls laugh when they feel safe, and Sansa learned the kindness of a woman who could pick up a blade with the same lack of apology with which she picked up a hairbrush. In the end, the Pact was made of mornings like that and afternoons spent pretending to embroider lilies while she listened. Of evenings where she tested what she knew against maps pinned with wax. Of nights when dreams rose and lost their teeth at the first taste of true air. It was made of the taste of lemons and the memory of snow, of secrets bought for coins and secrets bought for bread, of men who pretended the city was a theater and the women who were tired of carrying props. It was made of the old pain that never left and the new courage that arrived in increments, like water filling a vessel that had been empty too long. The Lannisters did not fall on the first day or the second. No house ever does. But the first threads loosened in places no one looked. In a guard who switched his route to stand under a woman's window for an extra minute. In a merchant who decided to hide his impatience by arguing loudly about weights and thus showed his hand. In a maid who took to humming a song from Dorne as she scrubbed, and who the Queen's cousins could not help but listen to for the wrong reasons. The Pact lived in these small movements and in the understanding born between a prince who had known how to turn his anger into something that could be put on a table and discussed, and a girl who had become a woman by choosing to see without becoming the thing she saw. If justice is furniture rearranged in the dark, their work was to feel for the chairs and make a map to stop others from barking their shins. It was not clean and it was not quick and it did not promise a tidy ending. It was patience learned in a place that scorned patience, and it was faith not in gods but in the possibility that attention itself could be a virtue and that attentiveness might unbuild the structures men thought immortal. On a day when the city smelled briefly, mercifully, of rain that failed to fall, Sansa sat once more under the olive, alone as she had been at the beginning. She laid her palms on her knees and watched a bee worry at a flower that had the ill luck to bloom in a courtyard instead of in a field. The bee did not know politics or vengeance. It knew work and sweetness. It knew the way back to its hive because it had memorized the path. The prince's steps approached, that familiar draft of silk and deliberate quiet. He did not sit at once. He stood and looked at the city with her, as a friend might, as a partner might. "This is slow work," he said. "I have learned to be slow," she said. "Slowness is a kind of power. No one anticipates it. They never think you will still be there when their shouting is done. And yet," he said, sitting, so that at last they shared the narrow bench again, "I do not mean to be slow forever." "No," she agreed, and in her voice was winter and fire tamed forever just this side of harm. "But when we move, it will be because we chose the right hour, not because the city told us to dance." He laughed, an honest sound, neither savage nor gallant, and a breeze brought the ocean up the hill briefly, a clean blade passing once over the eyes of the day. When the breeze died, the city returned with its sour meat and trumpets and waste, and the olive stood with them, roots in its small bed, leaves turning in the light. "Very well," he said. "Today we collect pomegranates and inspect the shawls," she said, gathering her skirts, the ghost of a smile passing her lips like the slow, deliberate promise of work worth doing. They rose together and turned their faces toward the keep's interior, where women waited to talk and men waited to underestimate them, where the small knives slept in hair and the letters waited to miscarry their intentions into other hands. They walked, not quickly, through a city that believed speed was proof of importance, and though the path twisted through shade and glare, ash and perfume, the two of them moved as if they had already learned the route and were merely reciting it for one another, to be sure they both knew what they intended. to make of slowness a weapon, of listening a net, of patience a species of fire that could eat stone. They rose together and moved into the stone shade, the olive's small world shrinking behind them like a candle guttered by the turn of a door. The corridors of the Red Keep kept their own weather, cool where tapestries drank the draught, stale where men had talked themselves hoarse the day before. Sansa let the cadence of her steps match Oberyn's without meaning to, as if a drum far off had found them and decided to bring them into its habit. The day's work began with the harmless things that never were. Ellaria took Sansa to the cloth market by the postern gate, where women sold hyacinths made of ribbon and men pretended to care about lace edges while bargaining for a better price on the bolt of rough brown linen that would become the shirts of boys who would never see the inside of a sept without someone else needing to be buried. The woman who made ribbons from dye scraps sat on a stool behind a table that had been a door once, 3 hinges still clinging like old scars. She had clever fingers and an expression like a sigh folded and put away for later. "You came," she said to Ellaria, with the shabby grandeur of a hostess who never expects guests but knows how to entertain them even so. "And you brought a girl who knows the difference between thread and story." Sansa blushed, then willed the heat to level out across her face. "I like your ribbons," she said, because it was true. The one that caught her eye was the color of the sea when a storm thinks about itself. Not yet broken, a green shot through with something darker. "These ribbons are made of the city's mistakes," the woman said, without gentleness and without malice. "Dyers pour the last of the vat down a drain and do not think of what it could be if someone were patient. Spare cloth takes color with its own opinion. People think dye covers what is beneath. It does not. It argues with it." Her gaze flicked to Sansa's sleeves, the neatness there, and back to Ellaria. "Shall we sell to each other, or will you buy of me and I of you as last time?" Ellaria laid a coin on the table with an ease that suggested she was paying for the talk as much as the ribbon. "Sell me the blue that remembers the sea," she said, "and buy of me the news that the queen's cousin thinks the perfumer's girl is poisoning her aunt because she coughs when she eats cinnamon." The ribbon maker snorted. "Cinnamon makes the old cough, and so does everything else that reminds them of heat. The cousin should be grateful to have an aunt who coughs in the open. Coughing in private can mean a death no one pays attention to." Her fingers fluttered over the coils until they found the one Sansa liked without being told. She tied a knot neat as a bee and slid the ribbon across the table. "Here," she said to Sansa, "for a girl who will learn to keep knots where they cannot be seen." Sansa's gratitude had learned to be quiet, but she let it show at the edges. "Thank you," she said. The ribbon was cool against her palm, thin and stronger than it looked. She thought of what the woman had said, arguments between dye and cloth, and wondered whether that was what people read on faces too, the way truth and courtesy contested the same patch of skin. They left with the ribbon and with 3 small stories folded into Ellaria's sleeve. The perfumer's girl came from a fishing family and had learned to gut before she learned to kiss. A gold cloak bought Oberyn. Guests every 4th day and ate them in the stairwell behind the bell tower where no one would see his hands shake. A baker had begun to sell his old bread to a man who never haggled and always arrived at dusk with a cap that did not fit him. None of these stories mattered, but each had a taste that could lead the tongue to something more nourishing. "It is like making stock," Ellaria said as they climbed the stairs, her breath even, her steps deciding not to hurry. "Bones and water and time. Men laugh at stock. They do not know what meat owes it." Sansa tucked the ribbon into the narrow pocket sewn beneath the seam of her sleeve. The pocket Ellaria had stitched herself with the steadiness of a woman who did not like the arrogance of visible stitches. "What do we add to it?" "Salt," Ellaria said, "and patience, and onion. Onion is gossip that is true. It makes you cry because it is true." Oberyn waited in a room that had been a chapel once, before the gods had been moved to a higher place and the room's windows had been walled in. Now it was useful. It kept noise out and secrets in. He had chalk on his fingers and a list of names written on slate, but he did not cover them when they entered. Sansa glanced without reading. She had learned the difference between curiosity and trespass. "Your life smells of thread," he said. "And your hands smell of chalk," she answered, as if this were a courtly exchange about weather. It was about weather. The climate of the work changed hour by hour. He showed them a pair of maps. The first was a simple plan of the keep's lower levels. The kitchens, the buttery, the corridors that servants used when they did not wish to be seen by the guests whose meals they produced. The second was the same plan, but over it he had drawn lines, thin where movement was cautious, thicker where it was habitual. He had pinned tiny beads where certain kinds of talk were predictable. A bead by the scalding cauldrons for complaints about supplies. Another near the pastry bench for love stories told with flour on the wrist. A blue bead in a passage near the well where one could hear the echo of the yard and judge the hour by the change in noise. "We are building a schedule," he said. "Swords are one sort of weapon. Schedules are another. I would prefer to win with the second." "I never paid attention to how sound passes from a yard to a well," Sansa said, tracing the line that moved past the blue bead. "In Winterfell, the sounds were honest. Iron on iron, wood on wood. Here everything is crowded. A man can hear what he needs in the wrong place and learn the wrong lesson." Ilaria, who had paused by the door to ease a pebble from her shoe with a shrug that was very nearly graceful, said, "A woman learns to put her ear to stone. Stone speaks more kindly than men when it has something to say." "Come," Oberyn said, his finger tapping a corner of the map where the wine storage lay like a set of lungs. "Tell me who breathes here." Sansa let her eyes move over the drawing. "Men who do not wish to be seen carrying what will be seen afterward," she said, "and men who have business with the wine that is not drinking. Tokens are given in wine stores. A man will hand another a bit of wood and say a number and pretend it is the cask tally. It is not. It is a debt. The number is the degree to which he expects the debt to be honored." Oberyn smiled in the small, satisfied way of a man whose student has made a leap without breaking her ankle. "We will want a token of our own then," he said. "Not to pay a debt, to be mistaken for one." Ilaria bent and placed the pebble she had removed from her slipper upon the map, exactly at the junction between the wine room and the narrow hall that servants used to return to the main corridor without being noticed. "Put a stone here," she said. "It will break the habit of walking without looking. The man who sees it will be a man who is in the habit of seeing. The man who trips will be the sort who assumes the floor owes him flattery. I prefer to talk to the first." They spent the hour like that, leaning over a world in miniature, moving beads, imagining footsteps. Sansa felt a nervous joy under her ribs that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with competence. She had never known that this sensation existed, a warmth that came from being useful and being seen being useful without being asked to perform it prettily. When they were done, Oberyn wiped the chalk from his fingers and handed Sansa a piece of slate. "If you write the names you know on this," he said, "I will learn them by your hand and not by rumor. The hand shows what a mouth will hide." She wrote carefully, no names that would burn the paper. She wrote instead the names she had given the drawers in her head. Held breath, borrowed hour, absent glance, onion. She did not write little lion, though the name perched. She let the chalk's dust cling to her fingertips until Ilaria placed a wet cloth there and the dust became mud and then nothing. Afterward, Sansa went to the cushioned circle and stitched lilies that were not lilies, leaves that curled around themselves like secrets. The women there had decided to speak of jewels, of how jewels travel and why. One said a necklace had been pawned by a girl who had no ring. Another laughed and said all jewels are pawns, set on men's throats to keep them from being cut in the wrong place. Sansa bent her head and said nothing, pricked her finger once and said nothing again. When she returned to the olive bench, the day had let its shoulder go and the light slid off the city with a slow, reluctant grace. The next morning, Ilaria brought a length of coarse cloth and laid it on the table like a daring. "We will line this," she said, "with something that will not show unless a woman knows to look. A map in a hem is a better map than the one on a table. Men cannot resist tables. They think the world is improved by turning it into Fernie." "Tor." Sansa laughed before she meant to, the sound pure as a ladle dipped into a clean bucket. "My mother kept the household in her head," she said, "but she could read a ledger faster than the steward who wrote it. She used to run her finger down the columns and then across and then down again, and if the totals lied, she would tap the page and the ledger would be ashamed of itself. "We will do that to this city," Ilaria said. "We will tap the page. We will make it blush." They sewed the lining with thread the color of dust. If one did not know to look, one would never see it. If one knew where to put a thumb, one could read the city like a psalm learned in childhood and amended as the voice changed. Sansa found she knew exactly where to place things. Her memory brought back the rhythm of the kitchens, the way a cook's song rose and fell with the stirring, the moments when a boy leaned to catch a pot of boiling water and the whole room held its breath until the heat was on the floor and the boy's skin was unblistered. She stitched those breaths into the seam at the point where the corridor bent near the scullery. If Ilaria thought it strange that Sansa remembered the kitchens as well as she remembered the Great Hall, she did not say so. They took their map skirt. Ilaria made it a skirt because a man would never dream a map could be worn, to the gardens and let it flare once in the wind that came and then did not far from the foundry. Oberyn watched with a satisfaction he did not bother to veil. "You make a weapon a dancer can carry," he said, "and a dance a man will not think to defend against." "Cushions suffocate," Ilaria said, smoothing a pleat. "Skirts trip. I like to be the thing that trips." They were not alone in their noticing. The spider drifted in on a day so warm the sea seemed to give up and grow still. He arrived the way a careful man puts down a cup, without clatter, exactly where he intends it to be. He was perfumed lightly, as if in apology for the city's other smells. His smile contained sympathy in abeyance, ready to be produced when required as one produces a handkerchief. "My prince," he said. "My lady, and my lady." He bowed to Sansa last and not least. "I have been told there is a new art at court, the art of not dying of impatience. We practice perseverance as if it were a dance," Oberyn said. "Come to mock us?" "To learn," Varys said. The word laid gently on the table between them. "I have for many years believed that talk is as dangerous as rope. I am delighted to be shown I have been thinking too small. Talk could be a woven thing, with knots at the places one wishes to climb down. You make talk into a ladder." Sansa kept her face a piece of calm water. "Ladders can be pulled up," she said, and saw in a quick flash a man with a fox's smile and a little beard tugging a ladder up through a window while a knight's body thumped on cobbles below. She pressed the memory flat with her palm until it stopped squirming. "True," Varys agreed, "but ladders can be dropped as well, and often on very important toes." He looked to Oberyn and then to Ilaria, and finally back to Sansa as if he feared that looking too long anywhere would be read as an attachment. "There are few things I dislike more than watching history be written by men who have mistaken appetite for right. I would prefer different hands write the next chapters. Hands that know the difference between a feast and a famine." His eyes flicked to Sansa's. "And hands that have learned what hunger is without deciding it should be distributed." Oberyn did not offer wine. Varys did not ask for any. They spoke about shipping lists. They spoke about the dates on the casks that came up the river and how labels lied less than men but more than numbers. They spoke about coin that wore a lion's face and coin that wore a king's, and about how faces on coin always lie. Sansa listened as if the conversation were a complicated embroidery pattern, repeating and changing, requiring attention not to fall into the wrong line. "Pycelle," Varys said at last, almost idly, as a man might remark on weather, "has a habit, like all old men, of turning his back on the present. He turns it upon a little boy who brings him a certain herb for his digestion. The boy is paid too well for innocence. The boy does not speak, but the physician's satisfaction speaks. It is the kind of satisfaction that suggests the physician should never be allowed to choose which herbs go into whose cup when an enemy sits to supper. Then let us make sure he is busy on the wrong day," Ilaria said, her voice the purr of a cat that does not belong to anyone. Varys inclined his head. "You do see," he said. "It is a relief at last to be obvious." After the spider drifted off, a smell like rain arrived and then betrayed itself as nothing more than the sea crusting at the breakwater. Sansa sat with her knees turned slightly to one side and watched a sparrow hop along the balustrade with the air of a master thief. "He will expect us to be grateful," she said after a time. He expects himself to be grateful, Oberyn answered. For once, perhaps the world could accommodate him. He thinks the best of himself because he thinks the worst of men. I have less time for him than you might imagine, and more, both at once. Ellaria tied the sea-colored ribbon around Sansa's wrist and tacked the knot with a single thread, so it would not come undone without Sansa's knowledge. He wants, as so many want, to be the author, she said. But he is a very good editor. An editor's knife, wielded by the right hand, can take a great deal of nonsense out of a story. Nonsense began to diminish in little places. Sansa saw it first in the vault that had been a pantry before men decided the city needed boxed law more than it needed dried apples. The clerk there had the habit of licking the tip of his quill before he dipped it in ink, the way a man whose mouth was always makes a practice of it. She watched him from a bench where a lady would wait who did not wish to be seen to be waiting, and she counted the licks. Every third lick, a number tot up smaller than it should have. The next day, a boy delivered him a vial of syrup for his cough and a note that said simply, "Ink does not improve by being salivated upon." The numbers became honest, embarrassed into it. Sansa had not written the note. She did not need to know who had. In the kitchens, a girl who had learned to keep her face smooth came to Sansa with a thread of panic showing like blood through a thin glove. "My lady," she whispered. "Does your grace," she meant Ellaria, "know what to say to a man who has decided to be kind to me when I am not hungry for his kindness?" Sansa's belly dropped. The castle had hours when it disguised itself as a home. This was not one of them. "What has he said?" she asked, and the girl swallowed and told her. Clenching her hands around the knuckles as if each knuckle were a bead on a rosary she no longer believed in. "Men in this place offer kindness as a history lesson," Ellaria said when Sansa brought her the girl and the girl's shame and the girl's bravery. "They expect gratitude as tuition." She turned to the girl and spoke in a tone that did not scrape. "Tell me his name and tell me what he wears and tell me what he is most proud of. That last thing will be the handle we take hold of." He was a turnspit captain, proud of his efficiency and of the little songs he had taught his team to keep the wheel spinning in time. He wore sleeves rolled to the elbow and a ring that had been his father's, which he touched often, as if it would make him larger. Oberyn watched him an afternoon, humming under his breath, then set a new song in the room, one with a tricky rhythm that turned on itself, and a new boy with a cold in his chest came for a day and sang it perfectly, and the captain found himself out of time. And ashamed, which was the better thing, and took his pride to the yard and wore it out there with a staff in his hand and left the girl alone for 3 days that became a week that became a habit. The castle did not love him less. It simply loved him differently. This, too, Sansa learned, that moving a man did not always require blood, only the introduction of a new song. The queens, I found them the way a hawk finds motion. Cersei invited Sansa to sit with her by a window dressed in glass so thick it cast the day into the room like a rumor no one could verify. She had in her hand a string of pearls that had belonged to her mother or that she had decided did. "You are in fashion," Cersei said, rolling a pearl beneath her thumb as if it were a thought. "I cannot decide if I am amused." The Dornish. Her mouth made a shape of distaste and then smoothed. "You are young enough to think that southern heat will warm you. It will only demand thirst." Sansa kept her eyes on the street below where a mule refused to move and men tried to teach it to be less stubborn by shouting. "I choose my friends by whether they are interested in the day I am having," she said. She was not sure, even as she spoke, whether it would sound brave or stupid. Cersei liked bravery the way a cat likes a moving string. "And are they interested?" "They are," Sansa said. "They are interested in you," Cersei corrected, soft as milk, "which is different. Interest is not concern. It is hunger wearing a better dress." She held the pearls to her throat and did not fasten them. "Be careful. They will ask you to become the knife they do not wish to be seen to hold." Sansa could have said, "I know." She could have said, "So do you." She could have said, "The last knife you held to my throat was a cup of wine that was not for me to drink, and I learned a lesson that day, but not the one you intended." She said nothing, because silence was the only argument a queen hearing only her own blood would register. Cersei smiled, the way a woman smiles when she remembers that a girl is a girl and a girl can be arranged. "Tell me," she said, turning the conversation like a small boat. "Did the prince enjoy the wedding feast? One hears he has declined to be a cheered man. So few men decline that pleasure. It makes him remarkable." "He enjoyed the food," Sansa said, which was neither true nor false but did not leave tracks. "And he thanked the cooks." "Cooks?" Cersei said, with a distaste that would have scalded a lesser person. "Wealthy women have learned to worship cooks. They are priests of the appetite, and they tell us we are absolved if the sauce is clever." She set the pearls down on the table with a click. "The prince will tire of you, you know. He tires of everything. The Dornish are very proud of their boredom. They call it philosophy." Sansa stood without smoothing her skirt. "Perhaps," she said. "But in the meantime I will enjoy the mornings that are less heavy." She curtsied and left before the queen could decide whether to be insulted. Later, alone, Sansa let her hands shake and then stop. Courage was not in the not shaking. It was in choosing when to allow it. The Tyrell matriarch, too, had eyes. She sent Sansa one lemon, wrapped in a cloth neat enough to be a satire. With it came a sprig of rosemary and a note that read, "This should be company enough for the right girl." Sansa took the lemon to Ellaria and held it up like a small son. "Olenna has a sense of humor," Ellaria said. "It is a knife wrapped in linen. Be careful not to cut the lemon when you unwrap it." They visited the old woman in her garden. The roses there did not smell as they should, as if all the scent had been borrowed by heraldry and never returned. Olenna sat like a throne disguised as a grandmother and pretended her hands were too old to continue to be clever. "You wear Dorne like a shawl," she said to Sansa without greeting. "You should make sure it is woven tight enough that a stray thorn will not pulley. Thread out and leave you with a draft in your back." "Lady Ellaria taught me to line my shawls," Sansa said. "Drafts have become less of a worry." Olenna's mouth twitched. "Lines and linings," she said. As if she collected such sayings for an embroidery sampler she laughed at when no one saw. "You have learned very fast. Be careful with fast learning. Men do not trust it. Women envy it. That leaves you with boys and girls, and they are both too honest to keep you from harm." She reached out a hand and Sansa, after only the briefest pause, placed her fingers in the papery grip. "You will do," the old woman said, and Sansa felt at once honored and marked. "If you come to regret your island, you may visit my raft. I do not tip easily, and I carry too many knives for anyone to think me a safe place." On the way back, Ellaria said, "She expects you to come. She believes inevitability is a virtue. It is not, but it is a reliable method." "Will we work with her?" Sansa asked. "We will allow her to work near us," Oberyn said, his eyes on a jackdaw that had learned to pry a nut up with a pebble and now considered pebbles all day no matter if there were nuts, which was foolish and admirable both. "The Tyrells believe in the theater of kindness. The Lannisters believe in the theater of fear. I prefer neither. I prefer a rehearsal in a small room with the door shut. At night, they built other rooms." Ellaria took Sansa through the armory that was not called an armory, a store of things men did not see because no one had named them weapons in front of them. "Pins," she said, "are obvious. A hairpin is a blade that pretends to be a decoration. I have no interest in the obvious. I like the things men are ashamed to notice." She showed Sansa how to break a ceramic cup and hold the shard in a way that made the edge useful without advertising it. She showed her how to knot 2 lengths of linen and make a loop that could close a door from the inside when men insisted on keys. She showed her how to turn a bracelet into a tourniquet and a folded apron into a sling. "Dorne teaches its girls to be the last person a wrong man touches," she said. "Not the first." Sansa practiced with the quiet earnestness of a girl who has already paid for all her mistakes and would prefer to rent the next ones. She learned to breathe through the itch that came when fear was made to sit down elsewhere. When she had done enough with her hands that her mind could relax its teeth, Ellaria unbraided her hair and combed it out with patient strokes that made Sansa wish she could bottle that patience and pour it into mornings when the city woke foul. A small victory arrived tucked inside the day like a coin in a loaf. the captain of a watch, a man who had allowed his men to sell their hour to men who needed to be unseen, found himself brought before the queen with the wrong kind of rumor licking his heels. The rumor had been fed with scraps from a dozen tables. It had been taught to walk in a certain way and to cross a certain threshold with a certain confidence. The queen looked at the captain and saw the shadow of her father's disdain move across her face without her bidding it to. The captain saw it and swallowed and was finished. Sansa watched from the place where women watch, near enough to be blamed, far enough to be denied, and she let the moment build her a small wall to stand behind when the next wind came. The captain was replaced by a lieutenant no one admired but whose lack of imagination made him safe for a time. A piece repositioned on the board without the board admitting it was a board. "Do not expect gratitude," Oberyn said that night, running a whetstone along a blade in strokes as measured as prayer. "You will receive satisfaction sometimes. Satisfaction is not gratitude. It is better." "I did not expect anything," Sansa said, and found that for once this was true. The victory had not tasted like triumph. It had tasted like bread that did not crumble when you cut it. The trial everyone in the city talked of crept closer the way a storm does when men begin to comment more on their joints than on the sky. Tyrion Lannister had been taken, and the rumor about how had almost as many versions as there were mouths to carry it. Sansa kept herself from being a character in that rumor by the plain expedient of being always somewhere else when someone tried to recall having seen her act. Ellaria taught her the trick: to leave rooms at the same pace one enters them, to sit long enough to be remembered as a fixture and not as a visitor. Cersei had her corridors. Sansa made her own paths through rooms. Oberyn was asked the favor all men dream of and dread: to sit in judgment. He did not say so outright. He mentioned it while sanding a handle in the afternoon's high light, the dust motes making an honest storm of their own. "I have been asked to wear a face that is not mine," he said. "The face of a judge. I wondered if I should put it on, and then I remembered that masks are for thieves and actors. I have no intention of stealing a man's life by pretending to be something I am not." Sansa looked at him over the rim of the cup she held, the water inside catching the light like a little coin. "What face will you wear?" "My own," he said and smiled, and she saw that his own face included patience he had not been born with. "The face of a man who will not be bought with guilt." "Tyrion did not kill the boy," Ellaria said, with the relief of a woman glad to be able to say one true thing out loud. "If he had, he would have prevented worse, perhaps, and yet the city would demand something. It always does." "Then what will you do?" Sansa asked. "I will watch," Oberyn said and shrugged, "which is often louder than men suspect." Sansa thought of Tyrion with a complication in her chest that made breathing an act to be attended to. He had been kind within the limits a man sets himself to avoid breaking the lines he had been taught about women. He had not hurt her by accident. He had not helped her enough by intention. He had been the one human in a room of puppets and predators, and he had been helpless in the way men who are small are helpless. They cannot believe in their own invulnerability. She wished for him what she wished for herself: a chance to choose the next word. When the day of testimony came, the throne room turned itself into a mouth. People were swallowed and people were spat out. Sansa sat where she could see the faces without being seen to watch them. Illaria's elbow against her own acted like a shore. Men spoke about things they had heard and seen and imagined. Sansa took note of whose voices shook because they forged lies, and whose shook because they told truths that sounded like lies because the city did not like that sort of truth. She saw her own name pulled into the mouth and then let go because no one could hold it. It was too slippery with other people's stories. Oberyn said little. He watched as he had promised, and the watching made a shape around the room, like a fence that, though it did not imprison, warned the sheep that a wolf had not given up on learning to jump. When Cersei's gaze flicked to him, he met it without flinching and without making an argument of the stare. It was a courtesy and a refusal at once. Sansa realized that courtside's manners and battlefield bravado shared a bone. The city, not content to gorge itself on one feast of spectacle, began to lay the table for another. A combat was spoke of, The kind men dress in words about honor when what they mean is that they wish to be entertained by the possibility of death without having to read the last page of the story. Oberyn was a name that passed from mouth to mouth like a hot coal. He refused it. He refused it in a way only a man who had already proven himself could, and still the refusal cost him something. The look on some faces said, "Coward." The look in Illyria's eyes said, "Man." Sansa watched the refusal become a rumor and the rumor become a judgment and the judgment become a habit. She filed it with her other ledgers. She marked on the map the places where contempt collected in puddles after such a rain. "Let them call me coward," Oberyn said, lighting a lamp and cupping it until the flame decided to live. "The living have more names than the dead." "You can have new duels every day," Illyria said, leaning her hip against the table and smoothing a thumb across a wrinkle no one else would have noticed. "I am tired of the city believing that dying in public is a proof of anything but a poor imagination." Sansa did not have to say what gathered in her like a tide. Relief wedded to fear's stubborn persistence. In the wake of the refusal, other possibilities swam into view, as fish do when someone throws bread into a pond. Men who would not have approached them came with little boxes of information and opened them while pretending their fingers did not tremble. The Queen's handmaiden, not Absent Glance, but another Sansa had christened Softheel, brought word that Littlefinger had sent a ship around the point with no cargo and too much deference from the harbor master. The ribbon woman said that the boy who judged dust on horses' legs had seen more iron filings than usual on the guard captain's boots. A drunk mason told the Olive's gardener that a wall had been patched with something that would not hold if men hit it with the butt ends of their pikes. "Is it a wall that matters?" Sansa asked, pressing the seam of her skirt where Illyria had hidden the line indicating the curve of that very corridor. "All walls matter," Oberyn said, "but this one matters more than most. It holds the quiet door where men leave without saying goodbye." They walked there at dusk without looking like a procession, the three of them, and Sansa trailed her fingers along the stone as if she were counting the ribs of a sleeping beast. The patch was not quite smooth. The mason had been paid to do a work and had done it with the degree of care money deserved. Oberyn took a small hammer from within his sleeve. Sansa did not ask why it fit there, and tapped, softly, in 3 places that promised not to echo. The 3rd place spoke back to him with a different note. "Poor work," he said, and then, "Too quick." He was told to hurry and asked to pretend he had not been rushed. Illyria crouched and pressed her ear to the stone and smiled. "A terrible, beautiful thing." "And told to be proud of his speed," she added. "Men are killed by that compliment more often than by arrows." They did not break the wall that night. They did not even mark it. They left as one leaves a sleeping enemy who has not yet woken in the wrong bed. And they returned to the maps and the little beads. They plotted a route for a rumor that would result in a guard being reassigned to a post where he would be too busy to do a favor for a man who had asked a mason to hurry. They imagined a tray of sweets carried at the right hour in the wrong direction. They considered the weather, and whether the weather would agree to be persuaded to rain on the day a ship might leave. Sansa slept badly and then well and then badly again. In her sleep, she saw the olive growing out of a crack in a stone wall patched with regret. She woke to Illyria's quiet hands and the taste of mint in water and the knowledge that today's work would not be a victory but must be done. She put on the skirt with the map sewn into it and found that her body had begun to know it as a second skin. When she sat, she felt the seam press against her thigh at a point that told her who would be where at what hour. If she bent her wrist, the ribbons knot reminded her of the boy with the dust on his fingers, and she looked for him when she walked the courtyard and found him and asked him if he had eaten, which was not a question about food and not a question about food, and he nodded without looking up. ND wiped his fingers on his trousers and kept his knowledge for someone else's purse. "It will be a woman," he told her a day later unasked. The one who wore pearls and then did not because the thread was poor and she knew she would be mocked in the wrong company. She will pass through the quiet door because she believes men are fools when it comes to watching a woman who dresses as if she did not intend to be seen. She is right. He rubbed his fingers together. But the guard there has a mother who taught him to watch women coming from market. He will notice. "What should I bring him from market?" Sansa asked, and he looked up for the first time. startled into meeting her eyes, and he grinned, his teeth as clean as a promise. "Bread," he said, "the sort with the seed that gets in your teeth and makes you think about your mouth." She brought bread, and the guard took it with the embarrassment of a man who does not easily accept that a hungry day can be improved by kindness. A girl in pearls walked by and did not enter a door. Sansa waited. 3 days later, the girl walked by again and did not enter the door. The 4th day, the queen's cousin sent for Sansa and asked her whether it was true that she had begun to take an interest in the lives of men who sweat. "I like the smell," Sansa said, bland as milk. "It reminds me that the city does not run on perfume." "You are becoming clever," the cousin said, and Sansa did not ask why that sounded so like a warning pronouncement over a child at her name day. She made a mental note to put a yellow cross on the edge of the shawl she would leave where the cousin might see it and not understand. A letter arrived wrapped in wax that had been poured without attention and then pressed too late with a seal that had cooled. Oberyn opened it with the impoliteness of a man reading words that might reshape his day. His expression did not change, which is a change. He handed it to Ellaria, who read with her lips moving, and then to Sansa, who did not move her lips because she had taught herself not to. Though sometimes, alone, she did, for the comfort of feeling a word pass through. The letter was from his brother, Doran, who wrote in a style that made long sentences look like patience and not evasion. He said, in essence, "Be careful with your life and your love and your temper. The river you think is shallow is a learned liar." "He worries," Oberyn said, folding the letter precisely and tucking it into the lining of his sleeve. "He is right to, but he is wrong to think worrying will prevent the event worried about. Worry is a blanket you cannot sleep under." "Worry can be a pillow," Ellaria said, "for the man who wishes to nap while thinking he is at war." Sansa asked, "Will Dorne commit to the theater?" She meant, will Dorne set their banners and their appetites against the Lannisters openly? Will the Pact grow teeth with sigils etched on them? "Dorne," Oberyn said, "will commit to the day. We live long in the heat by doing so. If we commit to a season, the season changes and we are dead for being faithful to the wrong thing." He cupped Sansa's chin with the side of his hand as a good father might, as a doctor might, as a friend, and as a prince who understood that he could not take what he wished from a woman whose wish was stubborn as her name. "Do not seek comfort in promises men make to themselves. Seek the places where their habits betray them." Habits cracked. Pycelle, who had made a habit of pretending to be older than he was when it suited him and younger when it did not, found a thread woven through his afternoon in the form of a woman with flour on her sleeve and a recipe for a syrup that soothed the cough that had become fashionable among those who frequented rooms where smoke was a metaphor. He gave the woman a coin and a contempt that he thought she did not see and sent his boy to fetch herbs to improve it. The boy met a lad who judged dust on horses' legs and a loaf of seed bread, and the herbs that came back were not the ones Pycelle had wanted, and the syrup did nothing for the men who drank it while boasting to one another that they did not believe in being ill. And a man who wore pearls and a hat came to the quiet door and found it held shut by a loop of linen that required the right second pair of hands to release, and in the time it took to fetch those hands the guard finished his bread and learned something about the taste of seeds stuck in his teeth and how it made him think of his mouth, and that thought made another thought, and that thought grew into a question that walked from his mouth to Pycelle's room without a herald. "Sometimes," Oberyn said, "we do not need to break a wall. We need to teach a man to ask a question." The trial moved like a weather front, and the city arranged its fears around it. Men made arguments and women made plans and children made analogies with games in alleys. Sansa watched Tommen, the new boy, the king, be shepherded gently by hands wearing gloves so thin even kindness could pierce. She felt, as one feels when lightning has struck once and the sky is too clean, the inevitability of another strike. She found it in Cersei's eyes, and she found it in the absence of something in Marjorie's smile when she practiced by herself at a window, the way a girl will rehearse her face if she is clever enough to know that a face needs rehearsal. "Do you pity him?" Ellaria asked, and Sansa knew she meant the boy and the dwarf and, perhaps, herself. "I pity children," Sansa said, "and I pity men when they become children, and I pity women when they are not allowed to stop being children." She paused. Pity is a blanket as poor as worry. Better to place a warm stone at their feet and teach them to sleep. Illyria's hand found hers beneath the table. You are not children, she said. Either of you. Do not let anyone trick you into returning to the nursery because it is prettier than the yard. Lit. Clefinger returned to the city the way a shadow returns when a cloud moves. Sansa felt him before she heard he had come. A chill crawled up the part of her that had once been a girl who believed in songs and now preferred the plain chant of the ledger. He came not to see her, he would be too careful for that, but to be seen to have come for reasons no one would think were her. He brought ships' manifests and a small statue of some god from a narrow sea that men pretend to understand and a new smile that had learned to look tired. He wants you to think he is tired, Oberyn said, and it did not amuse him. He wants you to think he has wanted many things and received none and now seeks only a third-rate consolation prize. He wants me to think he is the only adult in a room of children, Sansa said. He forgets that a woman can decide not to be anyone's child. Illyria's laugh had dust in it. He will not forget, she said. He will simply decide that you are an adult of a sort men have written small laws for and large songs about. He will try to hum one in your ear while he organizes a law behind your back. They were not sure whether he had a part in the wall patched too quickly. They were not sure whether he had taught a pearl-wearing girl to walk like someone who does not intend to be seen. They were sure that his shadow lay over the harbor longer than it should have, and that the harbor master began to bow in a way a man bows when he has been told he will be looked at wrong if he bows wrong. Do not go near him, Oberyn said. He will make you a cause in his mind, and then he will make you a consequence in everyone else's. Sansa did not argue. She did not wish to see what she had already seen once and survived by accident and by the pity of a drunk knight. The drunk knight came near her once, stumbling in a corridor with a face scraped by his own conscience. He did not speak. He touched his hand to his chest, above the place where a man keeps his promises if he has any, and then he moved on, leaving behind him a smell that was not as bad as it used to be. Sansa let herself feel a pride so small it fit between her eyelids, and then closed her eyes on it until it dissolved. News travels on the soles of feet, and the feet that carried the next piece were clean, a girl's, a scullery maid who had learned to walk as if she were always balancing a bowl of milk. "My lady," she whispered to Sansa as they stood in a doorway everyone pretended not to know led to nowhere. "They say the queen will be rid of the maester and choose a new physician by letting the hands of the gods fall on their shoulders. And they say the gods' hands belong to a woman who cannot read but can count. The woman is angry. I think she would like to count in someone else's favor for once in her life." "Then let her count our wounds," Illyria said when Sansa brought her the scullery maid and the maid's milk walk. "Let her count our nights without sleep and our afternoons without breaths. Let her lay the numbers on a table and be impressed at how much arithmetic a woman can do without being taught." It was not magic what happened next. It was not even a plan. It was a habit exploited. The queen liked to prove she believed in gods by pretending to ask their counsel when what she wanted was a public rehearsal of her certainty. The woman who could count arrived with thumb-stained fingers and a solemnity that grew from knowledge and not from being watched. She counted. She counted the illnesses in the city and the deaths that arrived too fast in rooms that smelled of flowers. She counted coughs. She counted the times the maester had answered a call from a rich man's bed before a poor woman's child. She counted pearl strings in rooms where pearls should not have been. In the end, she laid the numbers on a table. The queen was irritated with the shape of them. A little square no one could pretend was a circle. Sicilian cows, Pycelle muttered, which did not make sense even to him. He was moved to a place where old men go to be out of the way. A new physician was found who had less taste for theater and more for dirt beneath the nails. Men who had purchased their coughs were disappointed. The women who had been sick all along found the line outside the storeroom shorter. It was small. It was enormous. Sansa put a green stitch, tiny, almost invisible, at the hem of a curtain in the prince's apartments. Illyria noticed it and did not say a word. They received a letter from the Riverlands written in a hand that had learned to write in a camp. Upright, careful, not graceful. a hand that had never expected to be clerical and yet had become so out of necessity. It spoke of a boy who had been a king and was now a story, and of a mother who had gathered her grief around her like a cloak and then had it torn from her shoulders. Sansa read the letter with her mouth a hard, small thing. She gave it back to Oberyn and felt the old rivers rise. "We cannot repair a book by sewing the edges of the pages," she said, surprising herself. "We must write new pages. We must write new margins," Illyria said. "Men always forget the margins. They place their words in the center and pretend no woman lives at the edges." Sansa sent a gift by a boy who was paid to carry vegetables and messages. It was a needle of bone wrapped in a scrap of linen from the skirt map. She told him to give it to the woman who counted and to say only, "For mending." She imagined that woman touching the bone and the cloth and feeling anger move in her. Anger that could be used as a shuttle and not just as a flame. On a morning when the sky had been washed clean by a night's work of rain, Oberyn took Sansa to a place in the city no one from the keep went unless he wished to remember what walls are for. It was a step down toward the river, where boys spat and men drank water and women washed hands that would not stay clean. A man sat there with a lute that had lost two strings and made an instrument of it anyway. "Listen," Oberyn said. "Listen to how he keeps time. That is the city's heartbeat. When it speeds, trouble has begun. When it slows, the city is bracing for a blow." Sansa sat on the steps and listened to the broken lute and felt her heart find and lose the beat and find it again. "And when it stops?" she asked. "Then we already know," Oberyn said softly. "We do not need to ask." She watched a girl knot her hair with a strand of wet cloth and thought of all the knots tied in the city that day. Loving, coercive, practical, ritual. She thought of the knot on her own wrist where the sea ribbon had been tacked, and of the little knot Illyria tied in the hem, and of the knot that meant two women had been in a room and one wanted very much to leave. She thought of a knot in a rope above a gallows and felt her breath stumble and then go on. They did not speak, for days sometimes, about the name that sat like a stone in Oberyn's mouth, the mountain. It was not because they were afraid of shaping the syllables. It was because names can sicken a day, and they had too much to do to afford the waste. When they spoke of him at last, they did it as if they were shelving a book no one had asked for. "Soon," Oberyn said. "Not now. The city cannot hold two kinds of theater at once. Let it finish with one." Sansa nodded. She did not know whether she would survive a fight between men who had turned their bodies into arguments. She did not even know whether she wished to attend. But she knew that if the fight happened, the city would not learn the lesson she wanted it to learn. The city loved a fight as a relief from thinking, and so they laid coins in the places where thinking might be persuaded to be a habit. They taught a fishmonger to count the fish twice and put aside the second count for the day when someone would accuse him of theft. They taught a scribe to keep a second set of names in his head, the ones he had not been paid to remember. They taught a girl to make a knot that would release if she pulled it and would not if someone else did. They taught a guard to like seed bread. They taught a boy to look at horse dust and think about iron and then think about the men who used it and then think about the hands that cleaned the iron off boots. They taught a woman who could count to count the times a door had been opened with a hand shaking and the times it had been opened with a hand steady, and to ask why. Cersei's anger became a schedule as well. It rose at breakfast, peaked in the hour after the midday meal when men are at their most predictable, and sank in the evening under the weight of wine and the knowledge that daylight would not let her finish what the darkness promised she could. Sansa avoided her at midday and found her less dangerous at dusk. Tommen, with Marjorie's voice written around his days like a ribbon that might hold if tied gently enough, grew into the shape of a boy who wished to be liked. Sansa could have loved him if she were allowed to. Instead, she allowed herself to stand once in a corridor and watch him pet a dog that did not belong to him and say, "There you are," to it, as if the animal had invented itself to spare him the chore. She put that little sound in the place where she kept other things that ached. The taste of Winterfell's mornings, the way Bran had looked at her when she had pretended not to understand his stories, the sound of Robb's laugh in the yard, the firm patience of her mother's hands. News from the north arrived like a bruise pressed with a thumb. The man who wore a flayed man on his banners had made himself a lord in rooms where men used to be ashamed to breathe too loud. Sansa took the news and did not collapse under it. She set it down beside the others. She told herself, "I will someday be the woman who walks into that room and makes the walls remember whose hands built them." She did not know how. She only knew that slowness is a road, and roads go somewhere even if they begin as paths made by bare feet. The wall the mason had patched badly came down on a day when the city believed it had seen everything interesting for the week. It came down not with a crash but with a sigh, and behind it a small room was revealed that had been many things. Storage, liaison, prayer, depending on the hour and the hour's need. There was little there. The echo of old confessions, the smell of old lies, a broom with a broken handle, a scrap of lace that might have been a cuff or a handkerchief. The guard who had eaten seed bread found the lace with his boot and did not pretend it had always been there. He picked it up and took it to a man who would not invent a story for it, and the man took it to another man who would, and between them a narrative was crafted that did not fit anyone's pride exactly and therefore had a chance at being true. Sansa stood in the doorway and did not enter the room. She did not want the room's air to cling. Ellaria entered and then left and tied the lace in a knot and then untied it and let it fall. "We do not need trophies," she said. "Trophies tell men what to love. We already know." They celebrated, if that is the word for it, with fruit and bread and a silence that had satisfied edges. Oberyn leaned back and considered a beetle trying to cross a wide stone. "You will go north," he said, and the words landed without any drama at all. "Not tomorrow, not next month, but you will. Your gait has learned to be long. It is a northern thing. Dornish girls walk like cats. Northern women walk like hunters." Sansa imagined the road stretched before her like an embroidery that had yet to be begun. "I will go when the going is a knife and not a wish," she said. "And I will not go alone." "You will never go alone," Ellaria said. "Even if your feet are the only ones upon the dust. You will carry the people who love you and the people who hate you. It is an annoying fact, but it is a fact." Letters M.O.V. Meetings happened in places that did not make the participants feel important and therefore were not remembered by those who thought importance was a kind of music audible at a distance. A woman in the Citadel wrote a short note to an old friend in Old Town about the behavior of shiprats. A man in a city no one had ever learned to pronounce wrote a longer one about the price of tin. A girl in a town by a lake wrote a poem about the way morning rice sticks to the pot when the fire is mean. The notes were sent and read and folded and used to wrap things too small to be seen publicly. Sansa knew she had become part of a correspondence she would never fully read. It did not disquiet her as it would have a year ago. She had learned that not knowing is not always a sign of danger. Sometimes it is a permit for sanity. One afternoon, she and Ellaria went to the sept and stood by the statue that wept because a mason had told it to, and watched the women do what women do when allowed to ritualize loss. One of them looked up and saw Sansa and did not scowl and did not smile. She finished her weeping and went to the column to wipe her face and pressed a coin into another woman's palm, and the other woman pressed the coin back, and it was a small wrestling match disguised as gratitude. "They do not know how to give without believing they are losing," Ellaria said. "It is a southern lesson. It is an ugly one." Sansa thought of her mother's lessons and of how giving had been a weaving then. You give to make the fabric stronger because you intend to wear it all winter. She thought of giving as a northern house does, in loaves, in wood, in salt. "I will teach them to give like that," she said. "Someday." "You will teach," Ellaria said simply. "That is more frightening to men than killing." Sansa received a letter written in a careful hand that tried not to tremble, from a woman in a valley where the wind speaks in a higher voice. It said, "If you are who you are, come to us when the snow allows, and if it does not allow, come anyway." She did not know how the letter had found her and did not ask. She folded it into her skirt lining and let the scratch of the words live against her thigh like a promise. Oberyn received a challenge in the form of a fruit with a knife in it, a joke that was meant to be read as charming and failed. He put the knife aside and ate the fruit and then sharpened the knife and then used it to cut bread. "Men," he said, "wish to be dramatic. Bread wishes to be useful. I will feed myself with both, but only one will keep me alive." Sansa, thinking of bread, took more to the guard who had learned to like seed. This time, he told her a joke about a man who tried to bribe a dog and was bitten. The dog, he said, did not understand money. Dogs understand fairness, Sansa said. It surprises men and delights women to see how well. The spring, such as it was, began to smell more like spring and less like the memory of it. A ship came in with oranges that tasted of salt because the nets had not been washed. A cart went out with bolts of cloth that had been measured by a man who did not know how to count but did know how to look confident while lying. Sansa stood in a window and watched Marjorie teach Tommen to move a piece on a board and not to be ashamed to lose. She watched Cersei pretend to be in another room while her heart stood there and learned to be silent. She watched a fat fly buzz against a pane of glass it could not see and wished it would find the open one beside it. She watched and filed and moved. If she was seen as a woman standing by a window in a dress that did not call attention to itself. If she was discussed as a girl who had learned to be very quiet. If she was counted as a mouth less for the cooks to worry about, which was a classification she did not resent. If she was loved by people who did not think of it often because they were busy surviving. If she was hated by people who had been told their hate would be useful and had believed it because it made a story of their lives that was easier to tell than the truth. On a day when the sky used up all its blue, Oberyn put aside all maps and knives and sat with Sansa in a courtyard that smelled of rosemary and iron and told her stories of Dorne that were not the ones men tell when they wish to be applauded. He told her of a woman who taught girls to swim with knives in their mouths so they would learn to keep their lips shut. Of a man who planted an orchard because he believed his sons would learn patience better from trees than from sermons. Of a child who refused to drink milk because it had not asked her permission and grew up stubborn and smart, which is a dangerous combination if not tended with humor. "Will you go back?" Sansa asked, not meaning now, meaning ever. "Yes," he said. "I am not a tree. Men like to pretend they are oaks. It is a joke we tell ourselves to avoid admitting we are reeds." He tilted his head and looked at her in a way that had no ambition in it, only respect. "Will you send for me if the North calls in a voice you cannot refuse without breaking something in yourself?" She did not think before answering. "Yes," she said. "If it calls in that voice, I will send for anyone whose arms can carry a weight without dropping it to admire their own steps." His laughter then was like the first good rain after a dry spell. Gentle enough to make no man curse, generous enough to make the timid go outside and put their faces up to it. The Lannisters did not fall. They frayed. It was more satisfying and more painful to watch. It meant that cruelty had to work harder at the small tasks and so had less time for the flamboyant ones. It meant that the queens slept less and the cooks were kinder to their daughters. It meant that the gold cloaks began to wish for easier postings and found themselves sent to war. Say once. It meant that a moneylender began to worry that his accounts would show a loyalty to lions that he could not afford if roses began to bloom at the wrong time. It meant that in rooms where plotting loved itself too clearly, men grew tired and began to say what they meant because their tongues had not been allowed to rest. Sansa collected those words. She set them beside her in a row and thought of them as pins. One day she would use them to fix something in place. "You are making a dress," Ellaria teased, watching her arrange them. "When you finish, will you wear it to a feast?" "I will wear it to a trial," Sansa said, without meaning to be dramatic. "Of one sort or another." Ellaria nodded, and the ribbon at her wrist chimed against a brass bangle. "Trials are only feasts held in a different room," she said. "The appetite is the same." Sansa slept that night with the window open and dreamed of snow that did not melt and of lemons that did not sour, and woke in the gray hour when birds argue and water forgets whether it prefers to be quiet. She lay and listened to the city's broken lute and decided she would leave a gift by the olive. Nothing large, something small the tree could recognize. A twist of ribbon, a pinch of salt, a thread pulled from her skirt map. She would leave, too, something for the bench. A word she did not need for the day, a word like despair or regret, and she would not pick it up again until someone had need of it more than she did. When she went to the olive, the bench had received someone else's offering. A stone with a hole through it, the kind some call hagstones, The kind children were to protect against knights that are not kind. She held it up to her eye and looked at the city through the hole and saw, briefly, what a child would. A small, harsh toy that adults have made cruel and interesting to keep themselves from sleeping. She lowered the stone and set it on the bench where a hand could find it without looking, and when Oberyn came, as he did every morning, with a piece of fruit and a question, she lifted her chin and felt the maps seem pressed warm against her skin. "What shall we do today?" he asked. "We will plant onions," she said, and he grinned as if she had answered a riddle that was not actually a riddle at all. They planted them. A story so true it made eyes water, a question so honest it made men cough, a kindness so simple it made women suspicious and then quiet, a refusal so careful it made a queen change her dress, a walking so slow it made a spy trip over his own fancy feet. They planted onions and harvested patience and put both into the pot, and the city, starving always, learned without admitting it that it had more appetites than the ones it had celebrated since the first stone was set. And when the wind came from the foundry at evening, Sansa went to the window and drew it into her lungs and let it remind her of iron worked hard enough to behave and of the sound of men being careful for once because they had been surprised into the knowledge that care might keep them alive. She breathed and remembered how to walk, and when she slept like a woman with a map under her skin and a pact written in a language no court could prosecute. The next day's harvest began with a pair of gloves brought to the bench by a boy who had become taller without his mother noticing. The gloves were old, the seams well set, the leather salted by sweat. Inside one finger someone had stitched a piece of string that had no purpose other than to remind a hand that all fingers are not the same length. "A gift," the boy muttered, embarrassed by generosity not filtered through commerce. "From the man by the river with the broken lute. He said your work has helped his wife keep her hours. She doesn't wait for men who make her late." Sansa didn't know whether to laugh or weep, so she did neither. She turned the glove in her hand and imagined the woman who would put her fingers into it and find the odd string and be annoyed and then comforted by something that kept her aware of difference. She slid the glove into her belt. "Tell him," she said, "the song keeps time." The boy nodded with the quick gravity of a child hired for speed and ran off to spend his coin on bread that would be gone by noon. Ilaria watched him go and said, "You will be good at being a lady of a place when a place has the sense to have you." "I will be good," Sansa said, "at being the place." The news that traveled next did not dress itself in theatrical clothes. It came on the air like a smell and then became a murmur and then a sentence. A cart of swords had arrived from the smiths, and one sword's weight was wrong. The wrongness was small. A man had to know the right weight very well to feel it. But the man who did knew, and he did not shrug and say, "Close enough." He asked, and the asking woke an argument in a room where men had become lazy about their standards because no one had died yesterday. The argument sent a runner to the keep. The runner was a girl who had learned to walk as if carrying milk. She did not spill the news. She delivered it into Sansa's hands because Sansa had taught her hands to be open when the world was honest. Sansa took the news and held it up to the light and saw the place where it thinned. A shortage of iron that made itself known only if one had paid attention to horse dust. A mason paid to hurry. A pearl string broken and retied. A physician moved to a room without flowers. A guard eating bread and thinking of his teeth. Pattern. Not a noose. A net. "We will pull," Oberyn said, and they did. And what slid to the surface was not a fish that could be paraded on a stick and cheered by idiots, but a knot of habits men had made friends with and would now have to decide whether to abandon. The captain of the Smiths Guild had been selling slivers of iron to a man who sold rumors to a man who sold quick work to a woman who wore pearls and anted to be on time for a secret she would not share. It was untidy, and the cleaning of it would be dull, and that was perfect. Kings fall to dull things if the dull things are allowed to pile up, and queens go mad trying to polish messes that do not care about their false reflection. They had, for a little while, another sort of time, not the fear time, not the rumor time. It was work time. Sansa gave herself to it like a woman who has known hunger and now finds herself stood in a kitchen with good ingredients and an honest fire. Sometimes she stopped and flooded with missing. Her father's voice, her mother's chiding, the sound Arya had made when she got the better of Bran and pretended she had not. The smell of wet dog that meant home in a way the scent of roses would never. She did not apologize to herself for these floods. She let them pass through, and then she returned to the chopping and the stirring. In those days, she and Oberyn wrote a letter to Dorne that was not quite a letter. It was a shawl lining cut into strips and sewn again into the shape of something a woman might wear to market. They sent it with a girl who had turned 16 without telling anyone, who had decided she would go home for a month because her brother had written that their father was ill, and then a month more because he had written that their father was better and did not need her but would like to have her face at his table for a while. The girl carried with her the map of a city that could not bear to be mapped. When she returned, if she returned, she would bring back the smell of orange blossom caught in wool. If she did not, the shawl would keep someone else from freezing on a dawn colder than it should be. Sansa did not know if she would ever see the shawl again. She did not know if she would ever see the girl again. She put the not knowing on the shelf where she kept sane ignorance and turned back to the table where a scarred piece of wood required sanding. The Pact, which had started as an idea under an olive, became something like a household. It had its chores and its odd pride and its stores that had to be monitored. It had its jokes about onions and shawls and pomegranates and small knives that did not know they were knives until placed in the right hands. It had its irritations. Men who would not learn to set a cup down gently. Women who would not stop believing that listening was a confession and not a skill. It had its pets. The boy with dust-stained fingers. The girl who walked like milk. The ribbon woman whose humor could cut cloth. The guard who had learned to like seed. The smith whose hand knew the right weight. The old woman who counted without the license men pretend is needed for arithmetic. And as in all households, it had its guests and its ghosts and its days when the weather defeated everyone's plans. On such a day, they did not make new plans. They mended the old ones. Sansa learned to be good at mending. She learned to enjoy it. And then, because stories are not kindness, they woke to a morning sharp as an edge and found the rumor about the mountain standing in the hall like a man bored with waiting. He had been seen. He had committed a violence everyone expected and then one they did not, which is the way to keep fear interesting. The city shook, not with earthquake but with the pretense of it. Men ran. Women did not. Sansa sat down and put her hands flat on the table and waited for her heart to remember its job. Oberyn put on no armor. He put on the face he had promised her he would wear, his own. Ellaria knotted her hair like a lash. They did not say the word revenge. They did not say the word justice. They did not say the word duty. They said, today's work. Today's work was, infuriatingly for a city that wanted a show, much like yesterday's. It involved watching. It involved breathing. It involved telling the right woman the right truth about where to stand. It involved sending a boy with seed bread to a guard and a message like a smile. It involved letting a queen exhaust herself against a man who refused to be drawn into the play she had prepared costumes for. It involved not drawing a sword. It involved cleaning a knife and setting it down carefully and choosing a smaller one and setting that one down too. Slow, Oberyn said to Sansa, when the day's hunger for crescendo threatened to turn his good sense into a drum. So slow they forget you can be fast. She nodded. She did not look to the door. She did not look to the window. She looked at the map in the hem and felt the stitch that told her where the men would be and was not comforted and was not cowed. The needle on the table beside her shone. She did not pick it up. It rained that night, not the false rain of sea or rumor, but rain, real and tired and sweet. The city slept beneath it like a child exhausted by tantrum. Sansa lay awake and listened to the sound of water correcting things. In her mind, she walked the path to the north a dozen times and then set it aside and slept. In the morning, she and Ellaria went to the olive and found that the stone with the hole had collected a little puddle in its circle, a small icing the sky. Sansa dipped a finger in it and drew a line on the bench. It looked like nothing. It was proof of the rain. For days, Oberyn said, appearing like a man who has always been there and was simply waiting for words to be available. For days until I must decide whether to turn a room into theater. You will decide, Sansa said, and it was not comfort and not demand. And we will turn the city into a rehearsal no one realizes they are attending. And afterward? Ellaria asked, feeling perhaps what Sansa felt. The turn of a page they could not read yet but could hear as it was being lifted. "And afterward," Sansa said, stealing a little courage from the wet leaf that brushed her knuckle, "we will keep doing the work, whether men applaud or not." He nodded. He pressed his mouth to Sansa's hair in a benediction that felt like the hand of a brother and not like any other touch. He kissed Illyria's forehead, and she closed her eyes like a cat catching sun she did not feel she had to earn. The day began, and it was a day, full and silly and dangerous and practical. The lemon in the dish was beginning to dry, and the ribbon on Sansa's wrist had frayed, and the seam in the hem had held, and the city left its broken lute on a step and went to find its hard work. In the 4 days, they housed women who needed an hour behind a locked door. They persuaded a baker to lose a loaf so that a boy would learn there are losses one does not punish oneself for. They told a smith a secret that made him blush with anger and then did nothing with the anger until it cooled into a tool. They stood in windows and did not become part of the view. On the morning of the 4th day, a gull cried at a pitch that meant a storm would not come. The sea performed calm. The sky pretended to believe it. The city put on a dress too tight and told itself it could breathe. Sansa drank water and tasted clay and mint and fear in that order. She watched the prince, and he did not glow with bravado. He breathed. He tied a knot and then untied it. He looked at Illyria and at Sansa and at his own hands and counted something none of them would reveal. He stepped into his day. Sansa remained with Illyria and with the work. They did not stand on steps to be seen. They sat on benches to be useful. They did not sharpen knives. They sharpened schedules. They did not pull tapestries down. They hung new ones. Thin ones men would look through without noticing the way their shapes were reframed. They did not pray. They counted. They did not boast. They rested their tongues. They did not hope. They made themselves ready to be satisfied with small correctnesses. Toward evening, a wind rose from the foundry, and the city let its stink touch its lip, and Sansa felt the indent of the seam on her thigh and knew where men were and where women had refused to be and where a boy had chosen to keep his hand closed around a truth because it gave him a way to believe in his own name. She sat still. She did not move until the light thinned. When Oberyn returned, he returned with his tiredness and his fury domesticated into a posture. He was not bleeding. He was not triumphant. He was correct. He stepped into the room like a man who understands that there is a difference between winning and not losing. Illyria stood and held his face in her hands and looked at the man she loved and took in the news she had known would be brought. Not joy and not ruin. A difficult victory that would not wash anyone clean but would mark the washing as a possible task. "Tell me," she said. He told them not the city's version, never the city's, but his. He did not rehearse his own cleverness. He did not weep his own withheld tears. He said, "I said no, and I said yes to something else, and I refused to make myself into their play, and I am still here." They ate bread and fruit and a piece of cheese a shepherd had pressed into Oberyn's palm without ceremony. Sansa thought of that hand, rough and clean, and of how gifts are better when they are embarrassed by their own sincerity. She put a new green stitch in a new place and did not tell anyone where. That night, the city tried to have another riot and failed. The streets were too wet, and the men too drunk, and the women too tired to be entertained by their folly. The gold cloaks pretended they had prevented it. The cooks pretended they had. Sansa knew that failure had 1,000 mothers, and that the one most responsible was often the weather. She slept. She dreamed. Not of knives, not of faces, not of courts. She dreamed of her mother's ledger, the column of names, the sums that had to be correct because winter was coming and mouths do not accept excuses for bread. She woke to a room that smelled of dawn and realized that the Pact had turned her into a steward of kinds, of pain, of patience, of days. She did not feel diminished by the thought. She felt steadied. When she went to the olive, the stone with the hole had dried. She lifted it and looked through and saw Oberyn coming with the day on his shoulders and Illyria with a lemon in her hand as if it were a little star that had agreed to be borrowed. She lowered the stone and stood and set her palms on the bench and felt the grit there and knew it for what it was. The city's little sand, the world's poor honesty, the residue of work. She smiled with her mouth closed and waited for them to come into the circle of the olive's shade, where they would speak about small knives and pomegranates and onions and shawls, and where, between them, with patience and weather and a schedule and a good seam, they would take the lion's pride and make it into thread. They would pull, they would stitch, they would loosen, they would bind. They would gather the city's nonsense and take scissors to it when scissors were needed and needles when needles were. They would feed the hungry with bread and some with justice, if the day had any to spare. They would teach the guard to like seed enough to ask for it. They would send letters written in the lining of a skirt. They would refuse theater and then perform their own rehearsals in rooms no one thought to eavesdrop upon because no one believes that work is interesting. And slowly, slow as an honest winter, the house that had thought itself untouchable would discover drafts in walls no one had looked at for a generation, and the drafts would become chills, and the chills would turn a woman's anger into a schedule she could not keep, and the schedule would begin to fray, and the fraying would be all anyone could talk about until the day came when a beam gave way. Not because a hero had struck it, not because a speech had been made, but because small knives and slow hands and stubborn women had worried tea day after day, and the wood had learned the truth of itself, that it had been hollowed long ago by men who believed their names would support the roof without help. That was for later. For now, there was a lemon and a bench and a knot to tie and a shawl and a boy to feed and a woman to listen to and a piece of chalk to be found and a seam to be stroked to be sure it still held. For now there was morning and the story as they wished to write it, patiently with margins, with honest sums. Not finished, not loud, not clean, not holy, but theirs.